Hello, we've reached the end of 1st and 2nd Samuel and the end of King David's life. So this is going to be my last video in this series. Today I'm actually talking about 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2, which are the story. Chapter 1 is the story of David's last days, and then chapter 2 is King Solomon, his successor, securing his throne. But it's part of the 1st and 2nd Samuel narrative. It's thought to be by the same writer because it's written in the same style, and it also completes the story arc, the narrative arc that began in chapter 11 of 2nd Samuel with David taking Bathsheba. And then it also has some pieces that go back all the way to the beginning of 1 Samuel, with especially around Eli's house being replaced by the house of Zadok, later the Sadducees. So 1 Kings opens with a really sad description of King David being old. And this is a problem because in the ancient Near East, the king's virility was linked to the success of the kingdom. A weak king meant a weak economy. So King David's advisors search high and low for a beautiful woman to bring to David, and they find Abishag the Shunammite, and she is a very beautiful woman, and they bring her to the king. And they hope that, and this alludes to 1 Samuel chapter 16, when the young boy David is brought to Saul's court to play music to help King Saul with his mental illness. And it also alludes to 2 Samuel chapter 11, when David orders the beautiful Bathsheba brought to him. But unlike the story of Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11, this attempt to revive David fails because David doesn't sleep with Abishag. So then there's a report of King David's oldest surviving son, Adonijah, making himself king. And Adonijah takes the same steps as Absalom did before him to make himself king. He gathers chariots, that is a military, and he gets support in the palace from Joab and Abiathar, so military support and priestly support. And David does nothing. But Adonijah does not have support of Zadok, David's other priest, and Benaiah, the royal guard, or Shimei, who is from the house of Saul. And Adonijah finally holds a big feast for his supporters and for David's other sons. But the non-supporters that were just listed and David's son Solomon are excluded from the feast. So then Nathan and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, intervene. And this is the first we've heard of Bathsheba since Solomon's birth. Nathan goes and tells Bathsheba what Adonijah is doing, and he suggests that both her life and her son's life may be in danger, and promises to support Bathsheba in making Solomon king. He also mentions this promise made to Bathsheba by David, that David swore to Bathsheba that Solomon, her son, would be the next king. But this promise isn't mentioned earlier in the narrative, so the reader is left wondering, did David really say this, or are Nathan and Bathsheba inventing this pledge to manipulate David? So then Bathsheba goes on her own to David's inner chamber, where the elderly king is attended by the beautiful Abishag. And Bathsheba says to David, "My lord, you swore to your servant by the Lord your God, saying, 'Your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne.' But now suddenly Adonijah has become king, though you, my lord, do not know it. He has sacrificed oxen, fatted cattle, and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the children of the king, the priest Abiathar, and Joab, the commander of the army. But your servant Solomon he has not invited. But you, my lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you to tell them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise it will come to pass, when my lord the king sleeps with his ancestors, that my son Solomon and I will be counted offenders. And then as Bathsheba's talking, Nathan enters, and he elaborates on what Adonijah is doing to make himself king, and notes who else Adonijah has excluded, that is Benaiah and Zadok, those who are still loyal to King David. And rather cleverly, Nathan doesn't mention David's oath to Bathsheba regarding Solomon, because Nathan's not supposed to know about this oath. So King David answers, and he finally acts like a king. Not only does he declare Solomon his heir, but then he abdicates so that Solomon immediately comes into power. He orders Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the head of the royal guard to make Solomon king, to anoint him. So there's a procession on the king's mule with Solomon being put on the king's mule, and then he's anointed. And then the people declare their support. They say, "Long live King Solomon." But meanwhile, Adonijah, Joab, Abiathar, and their guests are still feasting, and their feast is wrapping up, and they hear the commotion, the people crying their support for Solomon. And Abiathar's son Jonathan delivers the news of David making Solomon king. So the guests disappear, and Adonijah is left on his own, afraid, so he seeks refuge at the altar of God. So then we come to Solomon's first words and his first act as king, and he grants mercy for Adonijah, but it's conditional. He says, "If he proves to be a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the ground. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die." And then King Solomon sent to have him brought down from the altar. He came to do obeisance to King Solomon, and Solomon said to him, "Go home." So in Solomon's first act as king and in his first words in the narrative, Solomon establishes himself as being both merciful and just. And then King David dies, and his final instructions for Solomon are essentially a hit list. He asks Solomon to deal wisely with people that David didn't dare touch for whatever reason. So no sooner is David laid to rest than Adonijah approaches Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, asking for a favor. He wants to marry Abishag, the beautiful woman who served David in his own age. And here is something that modern readers might miss. But sleeping or having sex with the royal woman is essentially, amounts to claiming the throne. And we've seen this twice in the narrative already. First, when Abner in 2 Samuel chapter 3 is accused by Saul's son, the king in the north, of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines. And that's what initiates Abner to negotiate with David instead of staying with Saul's son. And then we also see it with Absalom in 2 Samuel chapter 16 as part of his rebellion against David. He sleeps quite publicly with David's concubines who have been left behind in Jerusalem. But Bathsheba agrees, and she goes to Solomon and asks for what she calls a small favor. But Solomon immediately sees that this is a problem. His rival is maneuvering for the throne now that David is dead. Bathsheba's motivation is a little unclear because it's only described in dialogue. Is she naively passing on Adonijah's request? Doubtful. It's more likely that Bathsheba knowingly gives her son the grounds to execute his rival. So Adonijah has made a huge miscalculation. He's maybe been testing what he can get away with from his much younger brother, but it leads to his death. Solomon had shown mercy to Adonijah, but now Adonijah has proven himself unreliable, unfaithful to Solomon, and he is executed. So Solomon now has shown himself to be both merciful and just, and also a shrewd politician who understands the Game of Thrones, despite being a much younger son than Adonijah. And then at this time, Solomon also takes the opportunity to deal with Adonijah's supporters, Abiathar the priest, and Joab the military commander. Abiathar is removed from his priestly duties and subject to house arrest. And Abiathar and his son Jonathan are the last of the house of Eli. So with Abiathar being removed from the priestly roster, the house of Eli is fully replaced by Zadok and sons, who later become known as the Sadducees. And so this goes all the way back to the beginning of 1 Samuel with the oracle against Eli's evil sons. And then Joab repeats Adonijah's act of seeking refuge at the altar of God. But Solomon is firm this time, and Joab, who had murdered two of his rivals, Abner and another cousin who David had made military commander, is executed by Benaiah, who then replaces him as Solomon's military commander. And then there's just one more potential rival that Solomon has to deal with, and that is Shimei from the house of Saul. And Shimei had cursed David during Absalom's rebellion, but then he was dealt mercifully with by David. However, he was on David's hit list alongside Joab. So Solomon initially appears merciful, but also prudent, not allowing Shimei to go into the region of the territory of the tribe of Benjamin, and requiring him to stay around Jerusalem. But later, 3 years later, Shimei breaks his parole conditions, and Solomon uses that as grounds to have him executed as well. So then chapter 2 of 1 Kings concludes, "So the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon." And all of that, is how the Davidic dynasty came to be established, the story of 1 and 2 Samuel and the rise of David's dynasty.